All right, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to another event with the John Quincy Adams Society. Really excited for our discussion tonight. But first off, let me drop a couple of links into the chat for some upcoming events that we have. This includes both some in-person events here in DC and some digital events like this one. So next week, Wednesday, we've got the launch of our Marie von Brühl program for women in statecraft. If you don't know who Marie von Brühl is, she was instrumental in the writing of On War by Clausewitz. The 1st of December, we've got the DC Professional Network Social. On the 8th, we have Choosing War in Iraq, Lessons for Today. That's with Mike Mazar of RAND, who wrote I think one of the most authoritative accounts of the decision to go to war in Iraq in 2003. On the 15th of December, we've got Sam Moyne talking about his work on humanitarian law in war and his very provocative argument that it has actually made war easier to sustain, even as it has attempted to limit violence within war. And then finally, on the 26th of January, we've got Jonathan Hoffman on the U.S.-UAE relationship, another provocative argument that they are not a partner for stability, but in fact are causing instability in their region. There was a piece in Foreign Policy a couple of weeks ago that inspired us to launch this, which caused a bit of a firestorm. So we're very excited to hear his perspective. But speaking of the UAE and other Middle Eastern players, the debate tonight is really about a lot of the diplomacy that has been happening in the Middle East lately. We've seen rapprochements beginning to develop apparently between Egypt and Turkey, the UAE and Saudi Arabia on the one side and Qatar on the other, Iran and Saudi Arabia during this Baghdad summit process, Israel with Bahrain, the UAE, Sudan and Morocco, Turkey and the UAE, and then even Jordan and the UAE have been having some meetings recently with Bashar Assad's Syria. So the question is, why is it happening, and whether in particular perceptions among regional states that the U.S. is just not as into the Middle East as it used to be might be causing them to sort out their differences. As a reminder, we've got our audience Q&A feature turned on tonight, so feel free to drop questions in the Q&A area at the bottom, not in the chat, and anybody can read the questions and upvote the ones that you'd like to hear asked. But first off, let me introduce my co-host from our University of Florida chapter, Andrea Angulo.
Hi, John. Thank you so much for introducing us. We are very excited to be here. My name is Andrea Angulo, and I'm the current vice president of the University of Florida chapter. We're a relatively new chapter. We started last year at the height of the pandemic, so we are extra grateful for the opportunity to host Mr. Cambanis and Dr. Parsi. Mr. Cambanis is an author, journalist, and director of Century International. His work focuses on U.S. foreign policy, Arab politics, and the social movements in the Middle East. He's currently working on a book about the impact of the 2003 Iraq invasion on the international system, and is the author or editor of 6 other books in the Middle East. Dr. Parsi is an executive vice president on the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and co-founder of the National Iranian American Council. He has authored 3 books on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and has experience on Capitol Hill and at the United Nations. His PhD is from Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies. We are looking forward to hear from them, and thank you for being here. So let me introduce the first question. So Dr. Parsi, you argued in an essay in Responsible Statecraft on the new wave of diplomacy in the Middle East that Washington's turn away from entangling itself in the quarrels and stratagems of its Middle Eastern partners has compelled the region's powers to finally view diplomacy as their best option. Please take us through the new diplomacy and why you think that U.S. disengagement is a key part of why it's happening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrea, and thank you to the John Quincy Adams Society and for the Florida chapter for putting this together. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you. It's a great pleasure to be here with Thanassis as well, and look forward to his counter arguments and the constructive conversation we can have about this. What I argue both in RS, and it's actually a series of articles, mostly in foreignpolicy.com over the course of the last 2 to 3 years, in which the argument has been presented, and I think increasingly evidence has come to support it, that as a result of a conviction, increasing conviction in regional capitals in the Middle East, that the United States actually is serious about reducing its commitments and obligations in the Middle East and also its military presence. That has compelled several of the actors to start recalculating some of the positions that they have taken. For instance, if you take a look at the situation between Iran and Saudi Arabia, there's been plenty of opportunities for diplomacy between the two. There's been plenty of efforts from the Iranian side to talk to the Saudis. The Saudis have shown very little interest because, frankly, they had a very weak hand. They were losing in Syria, they were losing in Yemen, they were losing in Iraq, in Lebanon. But as long as there was this belief, this hope that perhaps the United States would be able to come to their aid militarily, would back them up, under those circumstances, the option of diplomacy was not particularly attractive for the very simple reason that diplomacy, at the end of the day, if you're coming at it from how they saw it, from a position of weakness, would mean that you would have to agree to all kinds of compromises, etc. If you could avoid that by simply hiding behind American military might and hope that the United States would handle that issue for you militarily or politically or economically, then that was a preferred situation. And as long as that option existed, that was the optimal solution for them. It's only when that option no longer existed, which I think has been a process from when the Trump administration did not strike Iran after the Iranians shut down an American drone, which they claimed had gone into Iranian airspace, to Trump not responding to attacks on Saudi oil fields that most likely Iran had something to do with, at least. All of these things increasingly cause these states to recognize that what they had expected, that there would be a continuation of the Carter Doctrine, the United States would defend them, go to war on their behalf. When that no longer was there, suddenly their calculations changed. And now you saw first from the UAE and Iran, and then later on Saudi Arabia, Iran, through Iraqi mediation. And just one more small parenthesis on this that I think is an interesting detail. This all, when it was happening during the Trump administration was not happy about it at all. They saw that as undermining their maximum pressure strategy vis-a-vis Iran. But through Iraqi facilitation, communication between the Iranians and the Saudis were increasing. In fact, when Qasem Soleimani was in Iraq, he was there, according to the Iraqi prime minister, to deliver a response to the Saudis through the Iraqis as part of this dialogue taking place. Once the US killed him in Mohandas, that dialogue actually froze for a while because, again, war was back on the table. Compromise was not necessarily necessary any longer. And you could see how that all froze. And then it restarted again with the Biden administration coming in and signaling clearly that whether he leaves Middle East altogether, nevertheless, there was a new equation in Washington, D.C. Now, will this lead to a wonderful solution and peace and prosperity in the Middle East? That's not my argument. My argument is, though, that as long as the United States has this massive military presence and is tilting the balance of power in various ways in the region, it actually disincentivizes certain countries from engaging diplomatically with their neighbors towards resolving those conflicts. That diplomacy may end up not working. But from an American perspective, I think we should be quite pleased to see that as we are pulling backward, countries in the region are compelled to step forward diplomatically, try at least to resolve their own problems on their own. Because at the end of the day, it's better for us that they handle those issues and those conflicts on their own without massive American involvement and without the US having either to pay any blood or treasure for it. Will it happen? Will it ultimately succeed? Remains to be seen. Is it perhaps just jockeying for power because of a changed circumstance? It may very well also be that. But even that type of a jockeying was not taking place diplomatically directly between these states prior to them being convinced that the United States actually is leaving.
So, Mr. Cambanis, let's bring you in on this. You stated in a response article to Trita's essay in World Politics Review that it is ahistorical and a little narcissistic to conclude that regional governments are talking only because of something the United States has done or not done. So take us through why you think Trita's wrong here.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have just differences of emphasis and maybe a couple of possibly major divergences in what we think the actors involved are going to do. So just, quickly, I absolutely think it's great for the U.S. to be less militarily involved in the Middle East. Our reflexively militaristic policy has created all kinds of terrible problems. However, there's I think Trita's argument and a lot of people's argument conflates communication with substantive action, and what is happening in a tectonic sense in the Middle East right now is there's not a question of the U.S. completely withdrawing from the region, right? The U.S. is in the process of a drawdown that follows a catastrophic and historic buildup, right? So from the Carter Doctrine in the late 70s till the invasion of Iraq in 2003, we've had a colossal and I would say, self-destructive and toxic American military sort of obsession and series of destructive engagements in the Middle East. So now we're in some kind of realignment. I would like to see it be a major military drawdown, and I would like to see the U.S. really reduce its military footprint and change to non-military modes of engagement with this region and with all conflict regions. But that's not actually what's happening, right? What's happening is a mild correction, and a lot of the developments that we get excited or at least react to in terms of for example, Trump pulling out of Syria or Biden ending the U.S. role in the war in Yemen. In practice, the U.S. Troop presence in the region has remained almost identical. The troops have shifted around, and the overwhelming modality with which the U.S. engages is military. So that problem continues. Now, the wave of diplomacy that's occurring, absolutely, I welcome it. I think it's great, right? I think it's great to see Iran and Saudi Arabia actually having a series of talks. They met recently, I think just a few weeks ago, again in Baghdad. I am delighted to see the non-dispositive, but the resumption of talks about restoring the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, and there's lots and lots of other avenues, which I think we'll get into in tonight's discussion around Syria, around Lebanon, around Turkey's involvement in the region, and so on, where diplomacy is occurring. However, and this is where I sort of reacted apoplectically to Trita's first essay. I don't see any substantive interest in the parts of any of these players in actually engaging in real diplomacy or compromise. So these are terrible actors, terrible governments. Iran and Saudi Arabia are sort of the worst among equals, but you can get into the weeds on what Israel's doing in the region, what Turkey's doing in the region, what the US has done in the region. There are just a series of ridiculous, maximalist, dumb policies, right? And what diplomacy works when players abandon maximalism in pursuit of their interests, right? And for now, the Saudis, although they're talking to the Iranians, have I would say a very unhealthy and unhelpful maximalist set of goals. We see this in their all or nothing approach to Lebanon, their all or nothing approach, at least until recently, to Syria. And by the way, so do the Iranians. The Iranians are a terrible force in the region, and they cause a tremendous amount of suffering for the people in the region. And from this vantage point, we talk about diplomacy, this upper level game. We often look at the role of extra players from outside the region, like the United States, France, others who Russia, the roles they've played in catalyzing and usually worsening crises. But actually, the crises are driven in the first order by terrible goals set by autocratic governments that pay no price for making the lives of the human beings who they affect miserable. And I would absolutely hold Iran, and Saudi in most responsible for this, but the list of particulars extends to especially the more resources a player has, the more damage they do, and they are never interested in for example, in Iraq, where the meddling of Saudi and Iran and the United States and Turkey, those four especially, has made this country ungovernable in a way that has killed hundreds of thousands of people since the end of the first wave of death that occurred after the U.S. invasion. And none of these actors is willing to settle for, let's say, half of their interests, or to genuinely encourage some kind of diplomacy that involves the regional players. On something like coming up with a negotiated settlement for a leader in Iraq, there is no momentum for it. And in fact, the diplomacy, again, while sort of useful around the margins, is not about anything, any of the serious things that are causes of conflict. And let's be clear. I mean, who's primarily responsible for the terrible escalation of military incentive diplomacy? It's the United States. I mean, the United States invaded Iraq in 2003. The United States assassinated two senior government officials, one Iranian, one Iraqi, in Baghdad. So, the level of official that the U.S. had traditionally not attacked. They assassinated Soleimani, and they also assassinated a senior official from their partner government, Iraq. And so, of course, what do they expect? They can't expect diplomacy to break out in any meaningful way. What they should expect is what we have seen, which is retaliatory attempts at assassination, for example, this weekend, of the Iraqi prime minister. So, that's my difference with Trita is not in, do I hope that his thesis is correct? Absolutely. I hope that as the U.S., first of all, I hope the U.S. really does draw down as opposed to shift. And two, I hope that when it does that, it leads to the local spoilers and bad actors deciding to stop going for broke and letting their people die in the process. But what I think is actually happening is slight shifts and a whole lot of increased destabilizing competition by maximalist parties who think they can gain a further advantage as new vacuums are created by their perceived retreat of the United States.
That was a really good answer. Thank you so much. So the next question is for Dr. Parsi again. So your responsible statecraft piece suggested that while it is too early to say whether the Baghdad process will deliver, withdrawal from the region predictably unlocked an untapped potential for the Middle East actors to resolve their problems on their own and try to build structures necessary to ensure a more peaceful and stable region. How optimistic should we be that a new stable regional order might emerge from the present situation?
Well, I think Thanassis just killed any hope for that happening. I'm usually the most pessimistic and cynical person on the vast majority of panels, but that's because I've never been on a panel with Thanassis before, so I feel very humbled. Let me get to your question, but let me also, if I could, engage Thanassis a little bit on some of the things that he said. I think one important thing to clarify is not that the US is leaving or not. If we just count troop levels, you're not particularly seeing necessarily the type of shift that I think many people in the John Quincy Adams Society would want to see, but also the one that is indicative of the change. What I think is indicative of the change is the commitment. I think it's very clear based on several events that have occurred that the United States is no longer going to die for the Middle East or for whatever it thinks it's achieving in the Middle East. That is clear, regardless of whether the troop levels are the same or not. And that is certainly the perception amongst regional leaders. They can't count on the US for this, in my view, for very good reasons. They should never have counted on it in the first place. That should never have been an offer that should have been made in the first place. So even though the troop levels have not necessarily gone down at that level, the commitment clearly is not what it was before. And I think yet another one of those data points that have cemented that perception is the fact that the United States withdrew from Afghanistan. After talking about it for more than a decade, eventually it was done. The Band-Aid was ripped off. I'm sure there's arguments as to how it could have been done better or not, but nevertheless, it was done. And I think that also just added to that wake-up call. I would love to see good governments in the Middle East. In fact, if instead of counting the bad ones, it's much easier to counting the good ones. The only one I can come up with is Qatar, but that's pretty much it. Sorry, not Qatar, Oman. But that's pretty much it at the end of the day. And again, I think Thanassis is quite correct. The extent to which you have more power, the more damage you can do, and the more you're tempted to do damage. Whereas when you have a smaller state that isn't particularly powerful, it's also much easier to be a good state. But waiting for states to become good and reasonable in order for peace and stability to take place, I don't think is a likely scenario, nor necessarily the path that historically have taken place elsewhere either. It would be fantastic if these states were human rights respecting democracies, but they're not. But there still needs to be diplomacy in the region and stability in the region. I personally do not think that the reason why they have taken their positions, whether it is completely maximalist or whether it's based on misperceptions, whether it's based on, in the case of Saudi Arabia, that the United States will eventually come and bail them out, as I think the calculation was in Yemen. I don't think that is necessarily because they're autocracies or non-democracies. I think the idea that there needs to be democracies in order to be able to get that type of a diplomacy, I've not seen the evidence for. If anything, you need to have strong states. And unfortunately, there's not enough strong states in the region that actually can make such big decisions. What is really missing and what is causing all of them to be stuck in this perpetual security dilemma is the fact that there isn't a security architecture in the region. There is no organization or those institutions built in order to make sure that out of the chaos that is the international system, some norms, some rules, some consequences are instilled. In the absence of that, unfortunately, all states, democracies or not, will behave in a very, very problematic way because they don't see any other path out for them. The question is if there is enough maturity in these states and sufficient converging interest to recognize that they're all going to be worse off if they don't try to do this. Now, what I am optimistic about is not necessarily that the outcome is going to be great, but it is the fact that the initiative for this dialogue is coming from the region itself. It is not being imposed on the region by the Europeans, by the United States, or for those who are worried that the Russians and the Chinese are going to come up and take over the Middle East. It's not coming from them either. It's actually coming from inside. And for any such process to have the buy-in and longevity, it needs to have that internal domestic regional ownership as well. And that gives me quite a lot of hope. Now, if you were to ask a year and a half ago, what are the prospects that there will be a summit in Baghdad? Almost every state in the region will come there with very high representation. The Iranians and the Saudis will be on the same stage together, and there will be an official recognition of the dialogue that they've already been conducting for more than a year behind the scenes. I don't think a lot of people would think that that is particularly a likely scenario, yet it happened. Is it the end of it? Is it peace in the Middle East? Are the Saudis not destroying Lebanon right now with the economic pressure that they're doing? No, unfortunately, we haven't seen that yet. But this is how it starts. It may not end the way we want, but this is how it starts. It does not start with out of the blue, security architecture just dropping on their heads and suddenly all MBS waking up and recognizing, you know what, I've been a really bad guy. I should be a really good crown prince and respect human rights and not pursue maxima. It's just not the way I think things have ever worked. So it is going to be a process. The initial steps are going to be small. And usually what we've seen in the region is that it is an externally imposed solution that has come. And there's been a tremendous amount of fanfare about it and praise in the West of, this is going to really work. And it's never worked. Now we actually have something that is coming from the region itself. That is part of the reason why I'm more optimistic that this actually can lead to something. But I think Thanassis' caution, to a certain extent cynicism, is also very warranted because it's an extremely, extremely difficult path. There's many things I'm worried about, from everything from maximalist positions, although based on what I'm hearing and happening in those talks on Yemen, there actually seems to have been a decent give and take on that issue, and an effort to walk away from maximalist demands. But again, nothing has been settled yet. But the fact that it's coming from the region, that it's doing all these things, gives me hope. And what I'm most of all worried about is that, going back to at least the frame of my own analysis, is that that some folks in Saudi Arabia will start thinking, you know what, this Biden guy, he's the anomaly, he's the aberration. Trump is going to be back 2024, and there's going to be another effort in which he will talk about leaving the Middle East, etc. But in essence, he's going to give Saudi Arabia the biggest blank check that it ever received, because that's what he gave them when he was president. And as a result, why do any of this diplomacy? Why not just run out the clock, but really wait for Trump to come back in, or any other Republican president that will be more open to rehabilitating MBS in the West, and then go back to the old game and go back to avoiding those compromises, reinstating the maximalist positions that Thanassis mentioned. So there's a lot of things that can go wrong, some of them coming from the region itself, some of them also potentially coming from the United States, or the perception that the United States actually can come back into the region.
So Thanassis, if you want to get in on that, on those particular issues that he just raised, feel free. But also I'd want to ask you, one of the other things you argued in your reply to Trita's piece is that the real driver for peace in the region would be a reassessment of interests by a lot of the key players in the region, that they currently see their interests in a way that is just fundamentally incompatible. So what is that? What is that vision that they have? And then how might a better vision of regional security look if they were to reassess their interests in a way that's better?
Well, yeah, I think that overlaps nicely with what I wanted to say about Trita's last points. I mean, look, we know that destabilizing conflict and authoritarianism and terrible governance are actually very sustainable, right? I mean, and we also know that like indigenous regional solutions can be just as terrible as externally imposed ones. I think the Lebanese civil war is a great, and post-war instability is a great reminder that like authentic local solutions or regional solutions to problems can be just as bad or worse as internationally imposed occupation-driven solutions. So that's one important thing to keep in mind. And I'm not sure. I mean, Trita raises a really important point, which I'm not sure where I come down on. I don't want to agree with him, but I think he's right about the lack of evidence. And that is the question of, does it matter if we're dealing with democracies or not? Does it matter if these states are halfway decent at governance and whether they care about people's rights, or is the thing that matters whether they are strong states, and how do we define strong states? I'm not as comfortable with, so I would agree that being a terrible authoritarian government, or being a destabilizing government who doesn't care about their people's well-being, in no way limits your lifespan. I mean, look at Iran since look at Iran since 1979. Look at really any of the states in the region. The Gulf, the Arab monarchies in the Gulf have fared better only in that they've had more money to distribute per capita to their citizens. But in terms of, so you can look at these Gulf countries and say, oh, they've done good jobs at, creating certain aspects of governance that are technical and service oriented. But they are, I think, very bad at governance. They're terrible when it comes to rights. And all of these entities agree through their actions that citizens don't have rights. The idea of due process is meaningless, and they all have very zero-sum views of their position of influence in the region. So Iran's long game has worked out well for its interests as it defines them. It's now a very influential player in many Arab countries. So in Iraq, it's the dominant player, maybe more dominant than any single Iraqi faction. In Syria, it is one of maybe as powerful as the Syrian government. It's the dominant player in Lebanon. It's the dominant player in Yemen, and its influence extends elsewhere. Now, the Saudis, would like to have the same amount of influence, and the only reason they don't is because they haven't been as good at it. But they also are meddling in all those same countries and in their near neighbors as well. And we have these, we had the ridiculous rift between Saudi and the Emirates on one side and Qatar on the other, which squandered billions of dollars. Now, rich countries, rich citizens. I don't think a lot of people were harmed by, literally by that blockade, but it shows that there's no, like in that case, they were making a play to crush Qatar's foreign policy, right? And so by extension, to crush the ways in which they saw Qatar helping the Iranians or helping the Muslim Brotherhood. Some things that Qatar actually is doing, some things that it isn't really doing, but they felt like they were. And they're willing to do this also with the wars in the region. I mean, the war in Yemen will end, and at the end of the war, Iran will have the power in Yemen that they were accused of having at the beginning and didn't. Okay, so Saudi and the Emirates started a war in order to stop the Houthis from being so powerful and so close to Iran, and as a result, the Houthis became much closer to Iran and much more powerful. And it will end in probably in a draw or a defeat for the Saudi side, and they will not reassess their foreign policy as a result of this, right? They will press, as they are doing right now in Lebanon, for an impossible outcome. So what we have in reality is terribly governed spaces with shared power, okay? In Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, you name it, there are multiple sectarian groups, there are multiple political groupings, there are multiple international players. They're all going to end up with some share of the power, okay? You can't get Hezbollah out of Lebanon. You can't get Saudi out of Lebanon, and so on. They're all going to be there in some constellation, and not a single one of these parties is interested or willing to negotiate in practice a power sharing agreement in these zones of influence. They're all working for all or nothing, and I do think this is where authoritarianism plays into it. If you're the government of Iran, you have very little political accountability for your foreign policy. If you're the governments in the Gulf, you have none, right? And so there are these sort of quasi, I won't say democratic, but there are some kind of public opinion feedback loops in places like Iran and Iraq and Lebanon, where, again, they're not democracies really in any meaningful sense of the word, but the government can't do 100% whatever it wants, maybe 95%. The rest of these countries, they're almost entirely unfettered from any political cost, and so their visions for the region can be unmoored from real interest as we might define them, right? So Saudi's interests in the region are to have Iranian influence go to zero in places where Iranian influence will never be zero, and they have taken that position in certain places for 50 years. Even they took this position even before the revolution in Iran, in some theaters where they were competing for influence. So they can afford to take this essentially delusional policy goal because they can afford to pursue it forever. And that means that we can expect, or at least we can expect there to be a lot of momentum for endless entropy in these spaces until and unless some of these powerful countries adopt a different ideology toward the region. And I don't see any reason to think that any of them will anytime soon.
Andrea, can I engage a little bit here?
Yes, of course.
So I think Thanassis is correct in the sense that, a state like Saudi Arabia, because the feedback loop is very weak, can continue to do things that are not particularly helpful and certainly not serving the interests of the nation or the broader people of Saudi Arabia. But I think it's perhaps a little bit one-sided. This, I know, is going to sound like some sort of a bizarre defense of autocracies, and please bear with me. It is not. Don't give Thanassis the benefit of pretending that he's like the Democrat and I'm the autocrat here. But reality is this. It's also precisely because they don't have any consequences that these leaders can make 180-degree shifts without paying a political cost at home. So you have MBS, for instance, giving an interview in May 2017, declaring that he's going to take the fight inside of Iran. Indeed, 3 weeks later, there's a massive terrorist attack in southern Iran. And talks about how there's absolutely no reason or basis for negotiations between Saudi and Iran because Iran has a crazy messianic leadership. What's the basis of negotiations under these circumstances? What is it, 3-4 years later, he gives an interview as if nothing has happened and said, the Iranians are our brothers. They're in our neighborhood. We need to get along with them. So we're going to have this dialogue with them. Very few democratic leaders would be able to pull that off. In fact, one of the things someone who works in policy in DC, I'm so frustrated by, is that in the American political system, fear of spending political capital and the political cost of making decisions that actually truly are in the US interest, yet we don't take those decisions because they're too politically costly, is an indication that, this idea that if you're a democracy, you can just, miraculously something awesome happens to you, you will almost only pursue good policies, and the feedback loop will make sure that the collective wisdom of your people always reigns. And as a result, you don't engage in really bad things such as, invading Iraq. It doesn't bear out. And again, it's not a defense or a wish for autocracy. It's just to point out that when it comes to making some very tough decisions, good or bad, democracies are not good at it. But autocracies have the capacity of doing so. If Saudi Arabia actually was a democracy, and God knows it is not, but if it was, and it was losing in Yemen, in Libya, in Syria, in Iraq, I'm actually not so sure that the democratic leadership of Saudi Arabia would have the ability to make a shift. Again, it's not to say that it wouldn't be better if they were. I'm just pointing out that we should be a little bit careful not to think that just because democracy is a very good political system, that it automatically translates into a whole set of different positive characteristics coming into the country's foreign policy. And again, looking at the conduct of the United States itself, a major democracy is perhaps evidence A that we should be humble in our expectations. The other thing I just wanted to throw out there, because we've been talking a little bit about it, we did a study looking at the interventions of Middle Eastern powers to kind of see, is it as simple as many people in Washington say that, there's one bad actor? Washington tends to have enough attention span for one bad actor at a time. And it was Saddam during a while, then it was Gaddafi and Assad. For a long time, it's been the Iranians. Just to see, is it really, are they the root cause for the majority of the problems in the region? And we studied every single intervention, Matt Petty and I, every single intervention by regional states from 2010 to 2020. And a very different image emerged. First of all, Iran is a major interventionist power in the region. And as a result, a major destabilizing actor in the region as well. Even though the Iranians will say that they're doing it from defensive purposes, everyone will. But what was fascinating was that it was not at all particularly more interventionist than many other states. We identify 6 states that are accounting for the majority of the interventions in the region: Saudi, Israel, Qatar, UAE, Iran, and Turkey. Iran, Turkey, and the UAE were in the top tier, but not particularly more so than the others. And for the last couple of years, the UAE and Turkey have actually been more interventionist than the Iranians. The lower tier is Saudi, Israel, and the UAE, and to a certain extent, the Saudi and the UAE and Qatar. To a certain extent, why they're lower is because they're actually financially more engaged in paying others to intervene on their behalf rather than doing so themselves. So the data there may actually not be entirely correct. What was fascinating, though, is that 5 out of these 6 states are armed and politically supported by the United States. And if we then pull that support, again, going back to what I said early on, I think there is a reasonable expectation that many of them will understand they cannot carry on these interventions or these wars on their own without American weaponry and without American political support. Under those circumstances, however bad they may be internally, however maximalist their positions may have been earlier on, I think it is not unreasonable to expect that they themselves may start figuring out that because they can't do it, because they don't have a get out of jail card and the US is not going to bail them out, that they may actually need to, at a minimum, stabilize the situation a little bit, de-escalate, diplomatically engage, and make sure that some of the worst case scenarios do not happen. Because some of this recklessness is actually driven by the belief that it's okay. If anything bad happens, the US will bail us out. And that actually really takes away any of the buffers that otherwise would have caused them to think twice. So again, going back to what I said earlier on, I'm optimistic that this can lead to something positive. There's no guarantee. There's many, many problems. But at a minimum, I think we can be at least happy to see that this mantra that has existed in Washington, which is that if we leave, chaos will ensue, so far has not been the case. Chaos was there when we were there. And as we are leaving, we're not necessarily seeing more chaos, and we're seeing some trembling initial steps, embryonic step towards resolving issues by the regional states on their own.
Or we created a lot of chaos, and now that chaos is getting worse. And I think this is where I see like the American goggles that allow us to say things that seem a little bit maybe unmoored from what's really happening in the region. So actually, there's a lot of chaos, and I would, again, point to the assassination attempt by what appeared to be, Iranian-supplied drones by an Iran-allied Iraqi faction on the prime minister this weekend. And I would also point at the really crazy escalation of the Saudi-led boycott of Lebanon. And both of these are happening now, and they are, so the moral hazard of U.S. military support doesn't turn out to be the driving factor one way or another in this kind of destabilizing conduct. So, I agree it's good to withdraw that moral hazard, right? I mean, like the war in Yemen, it's a travesty that the Obama administration, for some reason, thought they had, whatever. The justification I heard was, if we're gonna do this Iran deal, we have to give them our support for this war in Yemen, which is like, that's ridiculous. I mean, we didn't need their support for it anyway, and they did everything they could to tank it, which ultimately worked. And why we're now signed on to this war. As soon as Biden pulled direct support out, I don't think that's actually been. I mean, what's changed is that they've just been losing the war for 5 years. And so eventually they're gonna give up, and when they give up, they'll leave behind a huge amount of Al-Qaeda penetrated local proxies that they've set up and trained, that the UAE and the Saudis have set up and trained, and we're gonna hear from them again. So that there's not going to be a resolution just because the U.S. finally pulls out its culpability. And there's one other thing I want to say about diplomacy, which is, I can't say that we have led the way in sort of undermining the norms of diplomacy, but we've been thought leaders in sabotaging diplomacy as a viable way of doing things. And I would point especially to the Iran deal. I mean, this is something Trita's done a lot of work on, but we're all familiar. The idea that we can't sign a treaty in this country because we cannot get 60 senators to support literally any international. So forget about the Middle East, climate change, anything serious, we can't sign a treaty anymore. So we've now made clear that our international diplomacy on any issue lasts as long, maximum, as the term of the president whose administration negotiated it, which is, I don't think that's a democracy or autocracy problem. It's like a state credibility problem, because you have autocracies and democracies alike that manage to have consistent foreign policy, and you have ones that have this kind of disruptive, politicized foreign policy making. And I think that, as much as anything else, has set an example for that regional actors of this is how you use diplomacy. You use it to gain short-term advantages, to pursue maximalist goals. And if it doesn't work out for you after a year or two, who cares? Like the agreement you made doesn't mean a thing. And absolutely, that's not going to lead to a viable security architecture to sort of systemically calm tensions in the region.
So let me bring in some audience questions here. This one, the first one is directed to Trita. Why do you believe that an international organization to establish norms in the Middle East would create some semblance of order? And what sort of organization do you propose?
So it's not an international organization in the sense that, the UN would step in or something like that. It's about getting the regional states to, through regional diplomacy, start deciding what the norms for their region are going to be, the rules that they want to abide by, and through that bring in some degree of order in what otherwise is truly chaotic and outside of just international laws per se. That is different from the idea that, okay, here comes NATO and establishes order in the region. That's not what I'm talking about at all. It's about the fact that you need to create some normative system. And I'm not one of those believers that think that once you have it, everything is fine. On the contrary, I think the normative, if you manage to create the normative system, it's actually a reflection that all states have now, from a realist standpoint, decided that they think this is actually their best optimal solution. And it may not last long. It may last for 5 years. It may last for 10 years. But and if you have a system that is binding them to norms that they no longer see any interest in sticking to, then I don't think they will. But unless you try to go in that direction and create it, then you will have a situation, for instance, in which it is now the norm in the Middle East, not just the Iranians. It's the norm in the Middle East to create militias and support non-state actors in other states and fight that way with each other. It is the norm, for instance, to engage in destabilizing activities by supporting ethnic or other type of secessionist movements in other states. These are not things that are beyond the pale. I grew up in Europe, so I'm fascinated by how a region that was far more violent than the Middle East was, and had two of the worst wars in human history, made Middle Easterners look fantastic in comparison, that has more ethnic groups, more languages, and to a certain extent, perhaps even more religious diversity than the Middle East does. And now today, it is completely inconceivable that Germany and France would go to war with each other. That is a remarkable development compared to where they were before. And how is that achieved? How is it that suddenly norms were established and again, it was not enforced anymore, in which they decided they're going to continue to compete, but they're also going to collaborate, but there's going to be rules for that competition. And as long as there's enough of a consensus, it will actually become quite costly if you're the one state that is violating those norms or pulling out of it. It is something that I think is really fascinating, and I have no reason to believe that cannot be done in the Middle East. And by the way, when those first norms were being established, not all of Europe was democratic. There were plenty of states that were not. The leaders were, without a doubt, and I don't think that is unimportant, but not necessarily decisive. So what I'm saying in the Middle East is that when we are seeing trends that potentially can lead in that direction, in which their initial diplomacy is taking place, I think it is worthwhile trying to better understand why it's taking place. If we have something to do with it, and I think Thanassis is right, it's not the only factor, but I do think it is an extremely important one, because the American security umbrella in the Middle East has essentially made the United States the most powerful military actor in the region. To discount the importance of that, I think, would be a mistake. But if it turns out that it's actually us withdrawing if it is because we are telling them we're not going to just go and underwrite all your reckless policies, we're not going to bail you out when you do all of these different mistakes. From now on, you're going to pay for your mistakes yourselves. If all of that is actually helping bring this about, I think it should tell us something about our own conduct and our understanding of how we incentivize or disincentivize diplomacy, not necessarily always decisive, but nevertheless an important factor.
Thank you so much for that. I also wanted to talk about the Abraham Accords. So, Dr. Parsi, in recent years, you have also been growing alignment between Israel and the Gulf states, including normalization under the Abraham Accords. Do you think this arrangement will increase stability in the Middle East?
I do not. I think it's actually destabilizing, or on balance will be. What I see is that the region is faced
diplomacy leading to destabilization.
Sorry?
It's diplomacy that leads to destabilization.
Well, no, let me explain. What I see the region facing right now is, on the one hand, the old system in which the United States was stepping in as a military guarantor of several states in the region, and who, by and large, want the United States to stay. That's one of the reasons that the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Israelis were all against the Iran deal, because they recognized correctly that with the Iran deal, it actually would increase the likelihood of the United States being able to pull out of the region militarily. Now, one path forward is through an inclusive dialogue, such as in Baghdad. Prospects of it may not be fantastic, but nevertheless, it's actually fascinating because it's not organized against a country. People are not coming to Baghdad in order to say, okay, let's see how we can beat the crap out of the Turks, or how we can isolate this or that country. It's an inclusive dialogue with the aim of being able to actually substantively address the problems. The alternative is the Abraham Accord, which very explicitly has been targeting a specific country, which is a continuation of what we have seen in the region before. The United States tried to organize the region against Iran. It failed. It was extremely costly. And one way that it failed was because the Iranians further destabilized the region in order to make it more difficult for the United States to be able to succeed in its policy. And now you have a situation in which, when the United States is not available to do so, a proxy for it, a minor partner for it, is for the Israelis to step in and provide the same or a likening arrangement for some of these GCC states to continue of dividing the region in these camps, organizing against one specific country, but without the US committing to those security. Instead, you have the Saudis and the Emiratis, et cetera, being able to benefit from it. I think it will lead to a continuation of what we have seen in the region, which is more conflict and more instability. I think it completely screws over the Palestinians, which eventually will become a problem, even though it may not resonate as much on the Arab streets in the last 10 years because of the Arab Spring and because these countries have been engulfed by their own problems. But nevertheless, that issue is not going away. We can't just wish away the 6 or whatever million Palestinians, and puts the United States further into the camp of really working quite hard to kill any notion for some form of a two-state solution, while pretending that there is a two-state process in place, taking away whatever leverage existed to make sure that the Israelis would be compelled to give up the occupation, which again, if that continues for another generation, will be destabilizing for the region. If this normalization had actually come about, not because it's aimed at one specific country or a series of countries, and if there actually had been a give and take between them and Israel on the Palestinian issue, the analysis would be very different. But there wasn't. The Israelis didn't give a single thing. The United States gave the concessions. The United States took the Sudanese off the terrorist list in order for them to recognize Israel. The United States changed its long-standing position on West Sahara in order to get the Moroccans to come into this agreement. There was nothing the Israelis gave. So if you're sitting in Israel and this is what the Trump administration offers you, I'm sure you'll be terribly happy about it. Does it advance peace? Does it advance stability? Clearly, so far, we have not seen any signs of it. And I don't think there's any theoretical reason as to believe why a complete overrunning of the Palestinians actually is good for stability.
Yeah, I mean, the Abraham Accords are, Trita said something about the U.S. organizing the region against Iran. I think the region also organizes itself in these blocks as well. And there's the sort of Iran and Saudi camps, and then there's also these sort of overlapping Turkish sphere of influence that straddles both of these camps. And the Abraham Accords is, I keep going back to this. It's an alliance of authoritarians against Iran, and it does have absolute unfettered U.S. support. It would not have happened without all these U.S. goodies, and it's really destructive for our long-term aims in the region. I mean, I keep telling you, mentioning these things that are like Easter eggs for future conflicts, right? I mean, the abandonment of our longstanding position on Western Sahara is important because we are, we previously hewed to a vision of international law that did not recognize illegally occupied territory without some kind of negotiated settlement. And then, we changed it in this very little, this conflict that doesn't get a lot of attention, but that has been very well studied for 45 years, 46 years. We know what it means, and what it means is actually really bad for questions of sovereignty and for the idea that if you're going to occupy territory, you're going to have to resolve it through some kind of non-military resolution. And ultimately, what Israel has shown is that that it can keep. I mean, the argument was you can't occupy this territory forever. They either have to give it back to the Palestinians or they have to come to some kind of resolution that has political buy-in from people, including the Palestinians. And what they've shown is actually they can continue this, illegal and also, bad for various other reasons approach. They can continue it indefinitely and get a whole lot of support by, making common cause in this case with these Gulf autocrats against Iran. And don't forget that not long ago, when maybe me and Trita were young, there was an alliance between Iran under the Shah and Israel, right? So they don't need permanent alliances. They need 10, 20 years of partnerships with countries that are willing to acquiesce to what they're doing. And that is also now the U.S. approach, right? And to the extent that there was a kind of element of U.S. policy that was altruistic, and I don't pretend that it ever was really a moralistic policy out for the world's good and not for U.S. interests, but U.S. interests overlapped with things that were good for people in regions of the world, including the Middle East. And that, more and more, like the Abraham Accords, lays bare that the U.S. is not actually interested in the welfare and well-being and stability of this region. And that stability at a strategic level and also stability at a human level. The U.S. no longer sees that in its interest. And I would say, as I think we're probably about to end, I would say the one other thing that I'm not sure where Trita comes out on this, I actually think there's a lot more consistency across the last 4 U.S. administrations than is comfortable. I think Obama and Biden have maintained some of the really bad policy trends of George W. Bush and Trump's foreign policy, yes, with a lot more of a reasonable rhetoric. And on some things, they have meaningfully diverged from destructive policies. Absolutely. I'm not trying to paint an entire equivalency, but on things like the Middle Eastern conflicts, on things like not centering rights, on things like giving Saudi Arabia a blank check, I think the Democrats gave them a lot of rope as well. So unfortunately, I don't even think there's as much of a debate in the U.S. foreign policy space over how to do this as there should be.
So Trita, if you want 30 seconds on that, I can give it to you, and then we've got to end.
I think Thanassis is quite correct that there is far more continuity than oftentimes is recognized. And I think, frankly, it's because these 4 administrations have all adhered to primacy and believed in liberal hegemony and believed that the United States needs to dominate all of these different corners militarily. And as a result, for the sake of its interests, it will sacrifice values. Values have never been at the center. I think it's very dangerous to talk about it because it actually gives people the impression that values actually have mattered or do matter, and it leads to illusion and massive disappointment, perhaps cynicism, perhaps Thanassis has been there and has been burned by it. I don't know. So I think recognizing it for what it is important. I would also go to the extent of saying I think ultimately Trump's foreign policy was not a break with the past. It was an exaggeration of the past. It was a caricature of the past. And in some ways, he laid bare what always has been U.S. foreign policy. He had an ability to be honest about it in a way that previous presidents were not. When asked about why he continues to cuddle with MBS, despite what MBS had done, other presidents will probably have come up with some argument about the strategic need for collaboration against terrorism, blah, blah, blah. He just said they buy our weapons. And I'm not going to give up those weapons. He was honest. The others were not, because that is the key reason as to why this is taking place. And I think so people thinking that it's a break, I don't see it much of a break at all. I think it was an exaggeration of it. And I think saying that, America is back is a bit, it never left. It never left. It's always been this way. And perhaps some things are happening right now with a little bit more politeness, but at the core of it, I'm not ready to say that there's been a shift until I see that there actually is a shift in American grand strategy.
All right. Well, that is all the time we have. Trita Parsi, Thanassis Cambanis, thank you very much for taking the time to be our guests. Andrea Angulo and our University of Florida chapter, thank you for co-hosting. We will be back soon. Upcoming events are linked in the chat. So thank you again, everybody.